I got to interrupt our regularly scheduled update at this time. We've got breaking news. The preliminary NTSB report on the B-17 crash at Bradley Airport, Windsor Locks, Connecticut is out. This report clears up several questions we had about this accident so far, and folks in the media are already complaining about the lack of information in this report. Again, this is a preliminary report. It is only a preliminary report on the facts that they know at this time from the NTSB. Remember, it takes the NTSB over a year to a year and a half to fully investigate one of these accidents and get their report out. In between the preliminary report and the final report by the NTSB, we'll have an intermediate report, an interim report at about the halfway point, or about 6 to 8 months into this investigation. So this is just a preliminary report of the basic information. I'll put the link here to it, but I want to point out a couple of things in this report that are cleared up in this report. Acknowledge that the flight was operating under Part 91 Living History Flight Experience, which we talked about at length in previous updates. They cleared up the question about what kind of fuel did they have on board. They did have the 100 octane aviation fuel, 160 gallons on board, and that was tested out of the wing tanks. According to the preliminary ATC data, shortly after takeoff at 0950, the pilot reported he wanted to return to the airport. The airplane was about 500 feet above the ground on a right crosswind leg entry to runway 06. So once again, you were correct. I was wrong. I thought it was a left pattern. It's a right pattern. That means turning into the problem engines. That can be an issue. The approach controller verified the request and asked if the pilot required any assistance, to which he replied no. The controller asked for the reason for the return, and the pilot replied that the airplane had a rough mag. Now, this clears up the point. The audio that we were hearing in the recording was from air traffic control. It was not from the tower. What we heard on the ATC frequency was they needed to return to the airport to blow out the engine. Now, what you're going to find, I think, in this investigation, according to folks that are very familiar with the operation of this particular B-17, is that the magnetos on that number 4 engine were misfiring due to excessive moisture. If you look at the weather report there at Bradley at the time, the relative humidity was 78%, and we got a very close temperature dew point spread in this preliminary report. There may have even been some rain the night before. The magnetos on an 1820 engine or on any radial engine do not like to be wet. Once the magneto is wet, it starts misfiring and the engine runs like crap. Here's the location of the magnetos on the back or accessory case of the 1820 engine. Here's what a magneto Bendix scintilla looks like up close for the 1820. Each of these engines have 2 self-sufficient, independent magnetos to provide ignition. Each cylinder has 2 sets of spark plugs for redundancy from the independent magnetos, also for performance. We can discuss more about these engines and B-17G systems in a future update. So the reference to blowing out the engine appears to be, and I think you'll find that the crew was working on that engine before they took off. There was either a nitrogen bottle or a compressed air bottle. They were going in there, going into the back of the mags and trying to literally dry them out with the compressed air, get any moisture out of the mags. The magnetos are the ignition source of these engines. Each of these aviation engines have 2 magnetos, left and right, and 2 sets of spark plugs in each cylinder. So the controller made way for the B-17, got some other aircraft out of the way. An emergency apparently was not declared by the B-17 crew members and appeared calm throughout the entire communications with ATC and tower. In fact, the tower reported that the wind was calm and cleared the flight to land on runway 6. The pilot acknowledged the landing clearance at the time. The plane was about 300 feet AGL. Now on downwind, you should be at least about 1,000 feet above the ground. Tower controller asked about the airplane's progress to the runway, and the pilot reported that they were getting there on the right downwind leg. Further communications was received from the accident airplane. Witness statements and airport surveillance video, so there is a video out on this, confirmed that the airplane struck the approach lights at about 1,000 feet prior to the runway and contacted the ground about 500 feet prior to the runway before reaching runway 6. Then it veered to the right. Before colliding with vehicles and the de-icing fluid at about 1,100 feet to the right of the center of the runway threshold. Right about here in the de-icing storage facility. Investigators have found that the landing gear was extended and then the flaps were up by measuring the jack screws on the flaps, which indicates they wanted a low drag approach for these engine problems. So the gear was down and the flaps were up. Investigators tried to determine the position of the trim, the various trims, whether the elevator trim and the aileron trim, but some of that was hampered by the post-crash fire. And if you look in the B-roll footage, it looks like the aileron trim is trimmed in the wrong direction, but that may have just been bent or wrecked during the wreck. The number 1 and 2 engines remain partially attached to the left wing, and all 3 propeller blades remain attached to each engine. And it appears that those props were in the correct position for making power. The number 3 engine was recovered from the top of the de-icing tank. 1 blade was impact damaged and near the feather position. Again, if you look in the B-roll footage, you can kind of see where it appears, oddly enough, that 1 blade is in the feathered position and the other 2 are not. 1 propeller blade exhibited a 5-inch tip separation, and the separated tip sections were recovered 700 feet from the main wreckage. The number 4 engine was recovered from the de-icing building. All 3 propeller blades on the number 4 engine appeared to be in the feathered position. So they were having problems with the number 4 engine. They got number 4 feathered all right, but something was up with the number 3 engine, and we don't know yet at this time. This is what a feathered prop looks like, and it's to minimize the drag of a windmilling or dead engine. The wreckage was retained for further examinations. They talk about the fuel samples out of the number 3 engine's 2 fuel tanks, and they got 100 low-lead aviation fuel, the correct grade of fuel for that aircraft. They also quarantined the fuel service truck and found that the fuel in the service in the fuel truck was fine too. They talk about the experience of the pilots, 2 very experienced pilots. The guy in the right seat appears to be a retired airline pilot with loads of time, 22,000 hours. They verified that the aircraft was operating under a limited airworthiness certificate. And again, as we discussed on an earlier update, it's the Living History Flight Experience Exemption to FAR Part 91 that allows aircraft with a limited category rating to be operated for hire. Under very limited circumstances, primarily just short 30-minute history rides. They reviewed the maintenance records of the aircraft, and the aircraft is, instead of doing an annual inspection program like I do on this airplane where I inspect it once a year, they do a progressive inspection program where every 25 hours they're doing a portion of the annual inspection on the airplane. The airframe had accumulated a total of 11,120 hours of operation. Wow, engines number 1, 2, and 3 had 0 hours since major overhaul at the time. Engine number 4 had 838 hours since major overhaul at the time. I didn't know that about engines 1, 2, and 3 being 0-time engines. Again, it's engine number 4 that they had feathered, and it appears that they were having problems potentially with engine number 3. The most recent progressive inspection, which was the 100-hour inspection, was completed on 23 September of 2019. And the airplane had operated 268 hours since the annual inspection. And then they talk about the weather, which was really no factor in the incident. So I'll post a link to this report below. This clears up a lot of questions we had about this accident, but there's still lots to find out what brought this B-17 down. There should be no reason that one single engine failure would result in a landing like this for a B-17. A 2-engine failure is going to be a handful to handle. A 2-engine failure turning into those 2 dead engines are going to be a real handful. However, it does not appear that this aircraft stalled and spun in. It just appears that they landed well short of the runway and flew the pattern at a very low and slow altitude and airspeed configuration. We get more information, we'll let you know. Stay tuned. See you here.